January 5th, 1066. The cold winter air hung heavy over Westminster Palace as King Edward the Confessor drew his final breath. With his passing, England plunged into a succession crisis that would reshape the nation forever. The childless king's death set in motion a chain of events that would lead to one of the most significant turning points in English history. The Anglo-Saxon kingdom Edward left behind was wealthy and sophisticated. Its towns were bustling centers of trade, its monasteries were seats of learning, and its craftsmen were renowned throughout Europe. The English countryside was dotted with thanes' estates where free peasants worked the fertile soil, living according to ancient customs that dated back to their Germanic ancestors. But this world was about to change dramatically. Three men believed they had legitimate claims to the English throne: Harold Godwinson, the powerful Earl of Wessex; Harold Hardrada, the fearsome King of Norway; and William, Duke of Normandy. Each would stake their claim in blood. Harold Godwinson acted swiftly. As Edward's brother-in-law and the most powerful nobleman in England, he had the support of the Witenagemot, the assembly of English nobles. Within hours of Edward's death, they crowned him King Harold II in Westminster Abbey, the same church Edward had dedicated his life to building. The speed of his coronation suggested urgency, perhaps even desperation. Across the English Channel, William of Normandy received the news with fury. He claimed that years earlier, Edward had promised him the throne, and that Harold himself had sworn a sacred oath to support his claim, an oath taken while Harold was a guest, or possibly a hostage, in Normandy. William immediately began preparing for invasion. Meanwhile, in the frozen north, Harold Hardrada also prepared for war. The Norwegian king claimed the throne through an agreement made by his predecessor with England's previous king, Harthacnut. He assembled a massive Viking fleet, determined to take by force what he considered his birthright. The stage was set for a dramatic year that would see three massive battles, the deaths of two kings, and the complete transformation of English society. England in 1066 stood at a crossroads, and the man who emerged victorious would determine its path for centuries to come. Harold Godwinson fortified the southern coast, knowing William might strike at any time. He gathered his housecarls, elite professional warriors who formed the backbone of the English army, and called up the feared, the militia of free men obligated to serve in times of danger. But as summer turned to autumn, an unexpected threat emerged from the north, forcing Harold to make a decision that would prove fatal to Anglo-Saxon England. This was just the beginning. The events that followed would test the mettle of all three men, reshape the destiny of England, and create a new Anglo-Norman society that would influence history for generations to come. The year 1066 was about to become legendary.
September 1066. As Harold Godwinson's forces stood vigilant along the southern English coast awaiting William's invasion, devastating news arrived from the north. Harold Hardrada, the Norwegian king nicknamed the Thunderbolt of the North, had landed with a massive Viking army. With him was an unexpected ally, Tostig Godwinson, Harold's own exiled brother, bitter with resentment and hungry for power.
The Norwegian force was formidable. Over 300 longships had carried approximately 9,000 Viking warriors across the North Sea. They struck first at Cleveland, then ravaged the Scarborough coast. Local forces, led by Edwin, Earl of Mercia, and Morcar, Earl of Northumbria, attempted to repel the invasion, but were decisively defeated at the Battle of Fulford on September 20th. York, one of England's largest and most prosperous cities, surrendered to avoid destruction. Hardrada, confident in his victory, made camp at Stamford Bridge, about 7 miles east of York. The location was chosen for its strategic value, a meadow beside the river Derwent, where his army could rest and await hostages and supplies promised by the defeated Northerners. What happened next would become legendary. Harold Godwinson, demonstrating military prowess that would mark him as one of England's most capable commanders, force-marched his army north. His men covered an astonishing 190 miles in just 4 days, averaging nearly 50 miles per day in full military gear. The speed of their advance was unprecedented, and it caught the Vikings completely by surprise. On the morning of September 25th, Hardrada's army was relaxing in the warm autumn sun. Many had removed their heavy mail shirts and left their weapons in camp. They expected only to receive York's submission, not to fight a battle. Instead, they saw the glint of sunlight on steel as Harold's English army appeared on the horizon, their dragon standards snapping in the wind. The battle began with a parley. Harold, despite the betrayal, offered his brother Tostig peace and a return of his lands. When Tostig asked what Hardrada would receive, Harold famously replied, 7 feet of English earth, or as much more as he needs, as he is taller than other men. The negotiations failed, and both sides prepared for battle. What followed was one of the bloodiest battles in English history. The Vikings scrambled to form a shield wall, but many were caught on the wrong side of the river. A single Viking berserker held the narrow bridge across the Derwent, allegedly killing up to 40 English warriors with his great axe, before someone managed to float beneath the bridge and thrust a spear through the planks from below. Once the English crossed the bridge, the battle became a savage melee. Hardrada, true to his warrior reputation, fought in the thick of it, wielding his massive two-handed sword, Land Waster. He was killed by an arrow to the throat. Tostig took command but was also slain. The Viking shield wall broke, and the battle turned into a rout. The Viking army was virtually annihilated. Of the 300 ships that had carried them to England, only 24 were needed to carry the survivors home. The field was so thickly covered with corpses that, according to chronicles, one could walk across it without touching the ground. Harold had won a magnificent victory, but there was no time for celebration. Even as his men were cleaning their weapons, a messenger arrived with alarming news. William of Normandy had landed on the southern coast with an army of knights and infantry. Harold's greatest challenge still lay ahead. The victory at Stamford Bridge marked the end of the Viking Age in England, but it came at a terrible cost. Harold's army, though victorious, was exhausted and depleted. Many of his best warriors lay dead or wounded. Yet, they had to immediately march south to face a fresh Norman army, led by one of Europe's most capable commanders. The fate of England would hang in the balance, and the events that followed would change the course of history forever. While Harold Godwinson's army was still catching its breath after the triumph at Stamford Bridge, William of Normandy's invasion force landed unopposed at Pevensey Bay on September 28, 1066. The timing couldn't have been worse for the English king. The Norman Duke had been delayed for weeks by contrary winds, but now these same winds had prevented any news of his landing from reaching the north. By cruel irony, they turned favorable just when Harold's army was furthest from where it needed to be. William's army was a formidable force, representing the cutting edge of medieval military technology. His approximately 7,000 men included 2,000 cavalry, heavily armored knights who fought with lance, sword, and mace from horseback. Unlike the English army, which fought entirely on foot, these mounted warriors could deliver devastating charging attacks. The Norman Duke also brought thousands of archers armed with short but powerful bows, and infantry equipped with spears, swords, and shields. Upon landing, William immediately began to establish his presence. He built a wooden castle at Hastings and began ravaging the surrounding countryside, both to gather supplies and to provoke Harold into battle. The Norman Duke knew that time was against him. Winter was approaching, and he needed a decisive victory before his supplies ran out. Harold, meanwhile, received news of William's landing while celebrating his victory in York. Without waiting to gather additional forces from the shires, he immediately force-marched his army south. It was an incredible feat. His men covered approximately 250 miles in just over a week, averaging about 27 miles per day. By October 13th, they had reached London, where they rested briefly and gathered what local reinforcements they could. On October 14th, the English army arrived at what is now Battle Abbey, taking position on Senlac Hill. Harold's choice of battlefield was tactical. The hill offered a strong defensive position, and the surrounding terrain would make it difficult for Norman cavalry to maneuver. His army formed the traditional Anglo-Saxon shield wall, with the best armed and armored housecarls in the center, and the less well-equipped feared on the flanks. The battle began at dawn on October 14th, with a barrage of Norman arrows. However, the uphill angle and the English shields made this initial attack largely ineffective. William then sent his infantry forward to break the shield wall, but they too failed to make significant progress. The Norman cavalry charges that followed were similarly repulsed, with horses refusing to breach the wall of shields and spears. Then came a turning point. Part of William's army, probably the Bretons on his left wing, began to retreat. Some of the English feared, believing victory was at hand, broke ranks and pursued them down the hill. William, proving his tactical genius, turned this potential disaster into an opportunity. The retreat, whether planned or not, became a trap. The pursuing English were surrounded and cut down by Norman cavalry, and the shield wall had been breached. William then implemented the tactic that would win the day, combining arrow fire with cavalry charges. His archers were instructed to shoot high so their arrows would fall behind the English shields. This proved devastating, especially as the English were forced to bunch together to maintain the increasingly fragmented shield wall. The decisive moment came late in the day. As arrows rained down, one struck Harold in the eye, though some sources dispute this famous detail. Whether by arrow or by the sword of a Norman knight in the ensuing melee, the English king fell. The battle raged on until dusk, with the English fighting to the last around their fallen king's body, but the outcome was now inevitable. By nightfall, Harold lay dead, along with his brothers Gurth and Leofwine and most of the English nobility. The flower of the Anglo-Saxon military had been destroyed. William had won, but at a heavy cost. Perhaps a quarter of his army lay dead or wounded on the field. The battle's aftermath was immediate and far-reaching. William did not immediately march on London, instead circling the city and cutting it off from supplies. The English nobles, despite having a legitimate claimant in Edgar Atheling, were divided and demoralized. After some brief resistance, they submitted to William, who was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey on Christmas Day, 1066. The Battle of Hastings was more than just a military engagement. It was the death knell of Anglo-Saxon England. In a single day, the English nobility was virtually wiped out, and with them would soon go their language, their customs, and their way of life. The Norman Conquest was about to begin in earnest, and England would never be the same. William's coronation on Christmas Day 1066 marked not the end, but rather the beginning of the Norman Conquest. While he was now officially King of England, controlling the country would prove far more challenging than winning it. The years following the Battle of Hastings would see England transformed through a combination of military might, architectural innovation, and administrative genius. But the price would be paid in blood. Initially, William attempted to rule through a combination of Norman and English customs. He confirmed some English nobles in their lands and tried to learn the English language. He even issued writs in English rather than Latin or Norman French. This conciliatory approach, however, would not last. The first signs of serious resistance emerged in 1067, while William was in Normandy attending to his continental possessions. The English rebellions began in the southwest, where Harold's sons led raids from Ireland. In the Welsh marches, Edric the Wild allied with Welsh princes to resist Norman control. But it was in the north where the greatest challenge to Norman rule would emerge. In 1069, a powerful coalition formed, combining local English nobles, Danish invaders, and Edgar Atheling, the last male member of the Anglo-Saxon royal line. The Northern Rebellion initially met with success. York fell to the rebels, and its Norman garrison was massacred. The Danish fleet arrived with reinforcements, and it seemed for a moment that Norman control might be pushed back south of the Humber. William's response would become infamous, the harrying of the north. Moving with characteristic speed, William first bought off the Danish fleet with gold and promises of winter plunder along the coast. Then, he turned his attention to the rebels. What followed was not merely a military campaign, but a deliberate act of genocide. William's army systematically destroyed everything that could sustain life in Yorkshire and neighboring counties. Fields were burned, livestock slaughtered, tools destroyed, and entire villages razed to the ground. The devastation was total. According to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, never was there such destruction. Between the initial violence and the ensuing famine, It's estimated that as much as 75% of the population of Yorkshire died. Areas remained depopulated for generations, and some contemporary historians argue that the region never fully recovered from this devastation. This brutal demonstration of Norman power achieved its immediate goal. Organized resistance to William's rule effectively ended. The king then began implementing a comprehensive program to secure his control over England. The most visible aspect of this was the construction of castles. Unlike the Anglo-Saxons, who built their fortifications as community refuges, Norman castles were instruments of control, designed to dominate the surrounding countryside and population. The most famous of these was the Tower of London, begun in 1066. Built to overawe London's population, it combined military functionality with symbolic power. Similar castles rose across England. By the end of William's reign, over 500 castles dotted the landscape, creating a network of Norman power centers from which the conquered territory could be controlled. William also implemented administrative changes that would transform English society. The most significant was the wholesale replacement of the English aristocracy. By 1086, only 2 English tenants-in-chief remained from the estimated 1,000 who held lands in 1066. The rest had been replaced by Norman, Breton, and French nobles loyal to William. To manage this massive transfer of land and power, William ordered a comprehensive survey of England's resources, the famous Domesday Book. Completed in 1086, it was unprecedented in its scope and detail. Royal commissioners traveled throughout England, recording who owned what it was worth, and what taxes had been paid under Edward the Confessor. The English called it the Domesday Book because its decisions, like those of the Last Judgment, were final. The Domesday Survey revealed the extent of the transformation. Almost all English landowners had been replaced by continental nobles. These new lords held their lands not through traditional Anglo-Saxon customs, but through feudal tenure. They were William's vassals, owing him military service and loyalty. This feudal system, more structured and hierarchical than its Anglo-Saxon predecessor, would define English society for centuries. William also reformed the English Church, replacing almost all English bishops and abbots with Norman churchmen. This ecclesiastical revolution brought English church practice more in line with continental norms and strengthened the connection between church and state. The great cathedral building projects that would transform England's skyline began during this period. By the time of William's death in 1087, England had been fundamentally transformed. The old Anglo-Saxon aristocracy was gone, replaced by Norman nobles who spoke French, lived in castles, and operated within a feudal system. The English church had been reformed and reorganized. Even the landscape had changed, with castles and new stone churches rising where wooden structures had stood before. The price of this transformation was enormous. Thousands had died in the conquest and its aftermath, particularly during the harrying of the North. English culture and language were relegated to the lower classes, while French became the language of power and prestige. Yet from this violent merger of Anglo-Saxon and Norman cultures, a new England would eventually emerge, one that would shape the course of world history. The Norman Conquest of England was more than just a change of leadership. It was a cultural, linguistic, and social revolution that would transform England forever. The effects of this transformation would echo through centuries, shaping not only England, but also the broader English-speaking world we know today. Perhaps the most profound and lasting impact of the Norman Conquest was on the English language itself. For roughly 3 centuries after the conquest, England became a trilingual society. Norman French became the language of the royal court, government, and law. Latin remained the language of the church and learning, while English continued as the language of the common people. This linguistic division had far-reaching consequences. When English eventually re-emerged as the dominant language in the 14th century, it was fundamentally transformed. The language that Chaucer would write in was vastly different from Old English. Modern English vocabulary reflects this Norman influence. We have sheep, from Old English, for the animal in the field, but mutton, from Norman French, for the meat on the table. Similar pairs include cow, beef, pig, pork, and deer venison, reflecting the social division between English-speaking peasants who raised the animals and French-speaking nobles who ate them. Legal terminology was particularly influenced by Norman French. Words like court, judge, jury, justice, prison, and attorney all came from Norman French. This influence was so profound that even today, many English legal documents contain pairs of words, one English, one French, such as breaking and entering, or last will and testament. The Norman Conquest triggered an architectural revolution that literally changed the face of England. The Normans introduced stone castle building on an unprecedented scale, creating fortifications that would define the English landscape for centuries. The distinctive square keep, like the Tower of London, became a symbol of Norman power and influence. Even more dramatic was the transformation of ecclesiastical architecture. The Normans demolished almost all major English churches and rebuilt them on a grander scale. Durham Cathedral, begun in 1093, exemplified the Norman Romanesque style with its massive pillars, round arches, and sophisticated stone vaulting. These buildings were statements of power as much as places of worship, designed to awe the English population and demonstrate Norman superiority. William the Conqueror's reign laid the groundwork for England's common law system, which would eventually become one of the most influential legal systems in the world. The Normans centralized the administration of justice, creating a more uniform legal system throughout England. They introduced concepts like sworn inquests, which would evolve into jury trials, and systematized local courts. The development of common law was accelerated by the need to reconcile Norman feudal customs with existing Anglo-Saxon laws. This synthesis created a unique legal system that would influence not only England, but eventually much of the English-speaking world, including the United States, Canada, Australia, and many other former British colonies. The Norman Conquest introduced a more structured feudal system to England. While Anglo-Saxon England had feudal elements, the Norman system was more comprehensive and hierarchical. The entire country was now considered the king's personal property, granted to his tenants-in-chief in return for military service. These great lords, in turn, granted lands to knights, creating a chain of obligation that ran from the king down to the poorest peasant. This feudal system had lasting effects on English society. It introduced a more rigid class structure and new concepts of nobility and chivalry. The tournament culture that would later flourish in medieval England was a Norman import, as were many aspects of medieval courtly culture. The Normans were skilled administrators who transformed English government. The Domesday Book was just one example of their innovative approach to ruling. They developed the exchequer, a sophisticated financial system for managing royal revenues, and expanded the role of royal officials like sheriffs. They also introduced the concept of forest law, restricting hunting rights and creating royal forests that covered vast areas of England. Perhaps the most significant long-term impact of the Norman Conquest was the creation of a unique Anglo-Norman culture. Despite their initial brutality, the Normans didn't simply replace English culture. They merged with it. By the 13th century, the descendants of both conquerors and conquered had forged a new identity, neither purely Norman nor purely Anglo-Saxon. This cultural synthesis would prove remarkably dynamic. The combination of Norman energy and organization with English institutions and traditions created a society capable of remarkable achievements. The England that emerged from the Norman Conquest would go on to create one of the world's most stable parliamentary systems, develop a uniquely pragmatic legal system, and eventually build the largest empire in history. The conquest also tied England more closely to continental Europe. For centuries afterward, English monarchs would hold substantial territories in France, making them major players in European politics. This continental connection would profoundly influence English culture, politics, and warfare well into the medieval period and beyond. The effects of the Norman Conquest continue to resonate in modern England and beyond. The class distinctions it created influenced English society well into the 20th century. The legal systems of numerous countries still bear its imprint. The English language, with its unique blend of Germanic and Romance elements, has become the global lingua franca. The Norman Conquest stands as one of history's most complete and far-reaching cultural transformations. A single battle in 1066 led to changes that would reshape not just England, but, through the expansion of English power and influence, much of the world. In many ways, the modern English-speaking world is still living with the consequences of that autumn day when Harold fell and William claimed his crown.